Hi, everyone. It's Thursday, July 20th. Welcome to Thubten Kunga Ling's virtual Gampa. We're here for the second night of the three principal aspects of the path with Scott Tusa. With that, we'll start with our opening prayers.
Hey, we'll just take a moment to settle the mind if you want to close your eyes or leave them open. If connecting to the breath is a place that helps you to bring your mind into the here and now, go ahead and do that. If you do it some other way, working with the body, connecting with your feet, connecting with this sense of being on the ground or in your seat. And there's no time to worry if we're doing it right. There's no time to worry. Am I getting it? Am I meditating? There's no time for that. Just be present. That's it. With this presence of mind, we're going to move our presence of mind and color it or paint it with these attitudes of refuge in Bodhichitta. So as we recite the words, just allow the words to seep into your mind, into your heart in whatever way they seep in. For those of you familiar with these practices, with these ideas of refuge in Bodhichitta, see if you can connect with what you remember. See if you can connect with the heart of the meaning. And for those of you newer to them, just connect as best you can, remembering here we're essentially taking refuge in our awakened nature, that we have the potential for awakening, that these three principal aspects of the path that we're engaging in these 3 weeks are attainable because they're part of the nature of our mind. That's actual refuge. And then bodhicitta is that we're doing this not on just behalf of ourselves, but so we can be of greater service to the awakening of all beings. Doesn't mean we have to do it now, right? We're aspiring for that. So this is the essence of what we're training in. Great. So we'll chant once in English, just to allow the words to penetrate. We'll do once in Tibetan and then again once in English. We'll just recite slowly, allowing the words again to fall into your heart, not just become lip service. I go for refuge until I am enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodan sogi chonamna chanshu bardu dani kyapsu chi dagi chinyengi pe sonamgi drola penchir sangye ruparsho. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Now just allowing a sense of the meaning to penetrate for us in whatever way we can relate to that. One felt way is, I want you to imagine that there's so much care around you, whether you feel that currently or not. Just bring that into your mind. There's this care, this warmth that you're a part of, that the Dharma is both offering maybe other moments of care around you that you can recognize and remember, those who care for you, those who offered kind help or a kind word, or just smiled. If it didn't happen today, maybe something in the recent past. Just allow yourself to feel that warmth right now. Could also be from a pet or your relationship with family member, friend, house pet. And whatever intention brought you to this class, see if you can include in that intention a sense of care, that you are here because you care. It's essentially why we're here. We care to learn about the Dharma. We care to understand it. And why is that? Because we all feel, as we're gathered here, some sense that there's some profound truth in the Dharma, that there's something to the Dharma and how we engage with it in our meditation, in our path of study, in our path of understanding, our path of reflection that brings meaning and purpose to our life. So just connect to that sense of care. In a way, this sense of care is complete in itself. This sense of care is also a display of our own Buddha nature. So we can look at the Dharma as causal in the sense of studying the Dharma and trying to understand it like we're doing in our course here, or that there's completion in the sense that already within that innate care, it's a sense of searching, but the search comes back to oneself at the end. It comes back to our own mind. It comes back to our own awakened potential. Just remembering that for a moment. And it all gets simplified in this sense of warmth that we innately embody from others, within ourselves. And all other beings are also pursuing that. Whether they feel care or not, they're pursuing it in whatever form they think works best. Sometimes they're knocking on doors that are fruitful and offer some temporary care or relief. And sometimes they're knocking on doors that don't, or do the opposite. So there's a lot of confusion in how we seek care too, and how we seek our own mind, our own nature. We could call this seeking truth or seeking answers. It's another way to put it. So there's a heart of compassion within this, that as we're doing our own learning, our own transformation, our own understanding, our own practice, as we're informing it through care, think of others who are also on their own paths of that. Now, through our own path, we can become a light more and more for others. This doesn't mean we have to be something in particular. Just being our authentic Buddha nature at some point, as we uncover it through the path of these three principal aspects of the path, that's enough. Will benefit lots of people just like that. Hey, thanks so much. I'm going to close the door because the dog opened the door. Okay. So sometimes it's really useful to spend some time on those kinds of ways of practicing, making them less heady, making them less intellectual, because in these kinds of texts and these kinds of explorations, things can get very heady, things can get very, I don't know. Yeah, kind of stuck conceptually. So we have to kind of come back to its essence. So that was kind of a point why we were starting with that. So anyways, I'd love to just check in about last week and see if there's any questions, if you all have anything left over from last week's class, if there's anything, you reflected on from the Renunciation Mind verses that you want clarified, or just you want to share something that came up. Yeah, I'd love to hear what's going on for you.
that, I don't know if you can hear me, but
Yeah.
that you recommended, I'm finding sometimes I understand it and sometimes I don't.
Which one? Sometimes you understand, sometimes you don't understand.
Any money, work, and sex.
Sorry, say it again. Sorry.
Money, work, and sex. That book.
Oh, the book that I recommended.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm listening to it. I got the audio and it's like sometimes I don't know what he's talking about, but then sometimes I do. It's very strange. It's different.
Yeah. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was kind of his own force. We can just put it that way. And yeah, sometimes it's very poetic. The way he's speaking. It's like this. He's trying. I mean, there are transcripts of teachings, right? So those were live teachings given in, I think, the early 70s or mid 70s or something. It's like a series on work, sex, money. How to, how the Dharma applies to that. Basically, how the Dharma applies to life, especially like challenging life. And he had a gift of like teaching very directly. So sometimes if you're trying to understand it or fit it into a box, you'll miss it. You'll miss the point. So instead you have to like feel what the words are telling you. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes he's kind of direct, but he's often trying to point to an experience through that book. And a lot of his writings, like Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, is also like really famous book by him. Every Buddhist should read that, hands down. Like that should be required reading, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. Anyways, yeah, he's kind of different because he's not presenting like, here's step one, and here's, that he's not presenting it like that. He's just giving like, kind of some other style. So yeah, but you were able to connect with some, right? Yeah. You could check out some of his other material. Another one I really like too is Meditation. What's that called? The Myth of Freedom and the Way of Meditation. That's a really good one too. I mean, these are just classics. These are like I said, like every Western Buddhist should know these books. They're not new, they're been around since the 70s and 80s. But there's so much out there, to check out. There's so many books. There's so many different classes and teachers and lineages and styles. I mean, Trungpa Rinpoche, those books, they're generally coming a little more from like a Mahamudra approach in the Kagyu tradition, Kagyu Nyingma tradition. So there's slightly different languaging sometimes, but even within that, he was kind of his own force. So yeah, you have to read it as if he's not talking to your thinking mind. He's talking to your awakened mind. like how would we read a book if someone's not talking to our thinking mind? They're talking to our Buddha nature, It's like a different way to approach it, right? but good. I'm glad you checked it out. It's one of my favorites. It's really one kind of key thing from that book is he says, and by the way, that book's not related to what we're talking about in this course, right? It's completely not. The book I did say is related is the one by the Dalai Lama, his commentary on the three principal aspects of the path. I just I don't know why I recommended that book. Do you remember why I recommended that book, The Work, Sex, Money? There was some context to that, because it's not on, I mean, it's on Dharma, but it's not on necessarily this text, But I was going to say something. There's one key point in that text, which kind of is the thread throughout it, which is, normally we're trying to solve samsara. We're trying to get, even the Renunciation Mind teachings, I'll tie it into our teachings now. Even the Renunciation Mind teachings we explored last week, there's this sense of like, we need to become weary or exhausted with samsara, right? Like first recognize what it is, the more important thing is to recognize how our mind is engaging in samsara. But first, maybe we recognize it more as an object, but it should become more subjective over time as we reflect. But anyways, so sometimes there's this sense of like samsara being this thing that we need to get out of, that, we become weary of or exhausted with, and then we need to find some other kind of experience or some other kind of, like nirvana is not is not samsara. That's actually the first approach that's coming from foundational Buddhism, you know. But as we traverse in the different vehicles of Buddhism, we start to see they're talking about even Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti in the middle way teachings of Mahayana Sutrayana Mahayana teachings. They're not so much talking about some nirvana outside of the mind, you know. And so, anyways, Work, Sex, Money, what's really key in that book is he gives the practice again and again of like leaping in to a situation. You know, normally we're in with a situation. Like, let's say we're in an argument with someone. Normally we're in, meaning we're being the anger, and then we're not really communicating with the person. We are the anger, they are, or whatever they are. And there's this subject-object kind of battle. But when we go in, not in, when we go in through awareness, we start to recognize there's this space of continuity. And within that space of we'll talk about that next week, by the way. It really relates more to the emptiness teachings. There's this space of continuity or interdependence. And he's giving other ways to work with that. He refers to it kind of as a leap, like we're taking a leap into a situation or to be with a situation. And it's hard because it means we have to recognize there's not a way out of our anger, but there's a way in. You see what I'm saying? So the in is that we aren't the anger, but the anger can arise. It doesn't need to go anywhere, but it can arise, and we can be with anger, and we can recognize that anger is not self. So it ties into all the Buddhist teachings, but he's giving some kind of like ways of not using a lot of jargon, just sort of some ways of like direct practice. I don't know if you got to that chapter yet. It's like in chapter 3, I think. Chapter 4. Anyways, maybe I'm confusing you more.
No. I'm enjoying it. Parts that I understand.
Yeah.
And even I suspect the other parts are making some kind of imprints. So there you go.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing we read again and again. Different stuff will resonate more than others. But I think that aspect of that ultimately the Dharma points us to work with life, not to exit life. And that's tricky when we're studying the teachings we did last week, because it seems like they're saying, oh, exit life. Like a lot of people use the word renunciation, right? And they think, oh, I need to renounce and do something else. It's not like that's bad. Actually, that is part of the Buddha Dharma too, right? And it's not like that's bad necessarily, but it's delaying the truth, but it's also kind of a way to get to the truth, right? Because we're, like, let's say, even a basic Buddhist precept. Let's think of one here. Okay, like harmful intent, which is one of the 10 non-virtues of mind, right? Like where we try to avoid holding thoughts, wishing to harm others or other, sentient beings. So of course there's a value to this because every being values their life. So when we hold harmful intent, there's the potential we can harm something else. But on the level of like mindful awareness, that harmful intent is also creating stagnation, tension, negative propensities or destructive propensities in our own mind. And we're perpetuating those each moment we hold harmful intent, right? So then we might use one method to work with that of saying, well, okay, I'm having harmful intent towards this coworker, so I'm going to ask to be moved to the other side of the office, right? We might use that as a method, right? Or I'm going to go take a walk, or I'm going to go take my lunch break right now and kind of, if we're in the same space as them, right? And just get some space. That can be a skillful method because it can remove us from the thing that's triggering our harmful intent, but it's also delaying the truth sometimes. If we use the method to see the truth, that's fine, because I'll give you an example to make it not so abstract. So let's say we go take a walk, we're like, okay, I'm going to take a break for an hour, go get lunch and take a walk. And we do that. And then what we notice is that, all that harmful intent I had towards them. Sorry, I'm switching my video, Gina, to see all of you, but keep switching back. I don't know why. You all see me in the main view? Okay, that's what counts. I'm switching to the gallery so I can see all of you close up. So we take that lunch break, or we take that walk, or whatever, and we notice, yeah, like, why, we get some space. So we notice the thoughts of harmful intent, the object we wish to harm. There's not so much, there's less solidity to it, right? Because the object, the sense perception, what we're seeing, the person or hearing, is not there. So we get some space to see in the mind that our harmful intent is based on something that's not true, right? But of course, like, most of us don't see that way. We don't see it the way I'm describing it. We just get a little bit of space, and then we think, oh, it's so good to take a walk. That's what I needed. But that wasn't the walk. It was like separating from the object. So we got a little space. And that's a helpful Dharma tool, but it's also, it's a little bit slow. You see what I mean? Because, like, every time we're angry, if we got to take space, it's going to take a long time to recognize the emptiness of anger, right? Because we're going to have to go on a lot of walks, where when we meditate directly, on the nature of that thought of harmful intent, we see the thought as nothing. It's like, it appears, but we can't find it. There's no findability to it. And when we see that, we can, the person can be right in front of us, staring at us, and the harmful intent, we don't cling. We don't continue to hold that harmful intent. So you see what I mean? So all the skillful means of Buddhism, I think they kind of, skillful means really means it's skillful for the person wherever they're at. But there's also a kind of directness to them, right? So monastic vows, for instance, like, I was a monk for 9 years. Monastic vows are incredibly beneficial for a lot of different reasons, including, like, the lifestyle of it. But it doesn't guarantee that one generates renunciation mind. I'm like a good example of that. It doesn't guarantee it, because we can sometimes use things as an excuse not to work with the fundamental problem, right? Because we're taking, I'll give you another example. This might hit home a little more. We love the Dharma, which is great to have love for the Dharma and conviction in it. And then we kind of decorate our whole house with, sorry if this is hitting too close to home. We decorate our whole house with Buddhist images, and we light incense every day, and we do our thing, but we don't take care with our afflictive emotions. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, outwardly we're changing, but we're not looking inwardly at the main point. Now, here's another thing, because I don't want to be so black and white here. Every day we look at that, beautiful Buddha image we put in our living room, and we light incense, and it reminds us to work with our afflictive emotions. And then we go throughout our day, and it's hard to work with our afflictive emotions, and we get angry, and we struggle. But just that image reminding us, so beneficial, right? So there's many ways to work with this, but the point is, it has to turn us to look at the mind, to look at our experience. That's all what these three principal aspects of the path are, right? So I think we kind of have no choice sometimes, because what ego clinging does is it pushes everything to be external. And so we have no choice but to work with the Dharma sometimes externally. That's why we start with learning it. And then we bring it more and more close. So there's nothing wrong with any of us for doing that, but we have to know what we're doing. That's why I'm, sharing this with you. Now, we have to know that the point is not to leave it external. The point is to bring it closer, to transform our mind. And I'm just trying to give you a little tip or a little secret. That means we need to get used to being comfortable with our uncomfort, at some point. Now, not everybody's ready to do that in the beginning, and unfortunately, there's a lot of good things about the mindfulness movement in the world, and then unfortunately there's some harmful things where I think it's perpetuated the idea that we can feel good from meditation, as opposed to use meditation to go in and to be with the experience, right? And what I mean by this is, like, we can try to get rid of our anger, but it's like trying to stop a waterfall. I don't see the point so much. It's much better to know the nature of anger. That's what the next week we're going to talk about that. But also even this week, we're going to talk about bodhicitta. Tonight we're going to talk about bodhicitta. Bodhicitta and all the methods of developing relative bodhicitta, they also help to work with the waterfall of anger directly. But what I'm saying is we need to be willing to feel it. And I think sometimes it's risky because we think if I feel the anger, it means I'm going to like fuel it more and become more angry. But that's not true if we know how to turn with awareness. Awareness is just this quality of mind we're all cultivating in meditation. There's one good thing with mindfulness meditation where it's, it's been cherry picked out of Buddhism. It cultivates awareness, but we have to know how to use the awareness. If we don't know how to use the awareness, what use is it? It's sort of like, we could use the awareness to like, oh, that didn't feel good, or, that didn't feel, okay, now I found the right spot and I feel really good in my meditation. I don't know. This is not like bad. I want people to feel good, but it's not liberative. It doesn't do much, we'll get bored with that and move on to, I don't know, microdosing mushrooms, whatever it is, we'll move on to something like that. And again, see what I'm pointing at? It's not bad to be a healthy human being. We all need to develop more healthy psychological states, more healthy relationships, heal, elements of our trauma. I do a lot of work in that area with people through certain meditation practices. But if we stay there, we don't recognize the key, which is that, we need to learn to be with all experience. And being with it doesn't mean we become it. Again, Jack, that's what I was referring to with that leap. He's talking about in that book. When we leap into a situation and all the aspects of it, and more, the most important being our internal reactions, we learn to be with something without becoming it. So this is really one of the tricks of the Buddhist path. If we can follow, it's not in all the teachings, but if we can kind of pursue some of the practices of awareness that help us to be more and more with the experience, but not be of it. I usually say we're training to be with, but not of. That's how I put it, right? And awareness, mostly this is through awareness, in meditation practice. And that's not a thought process. That, I think it's a little more realistic to think of that more as a sensory process. We do that through the body, because thought itself is just an image all the time. Like when I'm talking, you all are generating images in your mind trying to understand me, right? That's all we can do. That literally is communication. So one of my favorite quotes, I like to share it often. It's from a well-known Buddhist teacher, Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche. He says, there's no such thing as communication. There's just constructive miscommunication and unconstructive miscommunication. And why? Because we're all generating images based on words when we're talking to each other. And why does that matter? Because when we recognize that, there's a key to freedom within that. Because we recognize the images are not going to liberate us. What's going to liberate us is working directly with our experience, our felt sense, our perceptions, yes, our thoughts, our emotions. But if we form another thought about a thought, you see what I'm saying? It doesn't get down to the point. It's just a thought about a thought. So a lot of the times, it's tricky because we're studying these things and we're just forming thoughts about thoughts. Anyways, I think I'm going too far down the rabbit hole. Great. Is there anything else around renunciation mind that came up, or anything from the teachings last week? Did you all explore it? Was there any kind of explorations that you tried? I didn't give so much practice advice, I think, just more sort of theory. Okay, let's jump into our next verse here. So now we're going to move into the second of the three principal aspects of the path, the principle of bodhicitta, or relative bodhicitta. So starts with verse 6, I believe, yeah? Yeah. So we have verse 6, which says, when through growing accustomed to thinking in this way, verse 6, yet if this renunciation is not embraced by the pure motivation of bodhicitta, It will not become a cause for the perfect bliss of unsurpassed awakening. So the wise should generate supreme bodhicitta. Cool. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this term bodhicitta. Bear with me here as I sort of define it a little bit, and then we go a little, more deep into it. And here I'm just trying to present a wide range. Some of you are maybe new to this. Some of you have been studying this for a long time, and some of you probably even have a practice of meditating on bodhicitta. So I'm going to try to cover angles from newbies to advanced folks here. So embedded in the verse here is just this sense that, sure, we can develop renunciation mind, a wish to liberate our minds from the bondage of samsara. And, there is a path for that. We call that the Shravakyana path, or the lower and medium scopes in the Lam Rim. And, you can find this existent in certain types of Buddhism, in the world that actually, they don't follow the Mahayana Sutras. They follow the Pali Canon, and the Pali Sutras. And that's their main goal is to liberate from samsara itself. Now, this is no small feat, I just want to say, if you meet an arhat, I've never met an arhat, but one of my friends met Ajahn Chah, who was like a really, really great Thai forest, in the Thai forest tradition, really great master. And I mean, he was pretty sure he had transcended, that he was a bodhisattva. So that's a different story, because I think the Thai forest is not straight Shravakyana Buddhism. So it's not a great example. But, this was a powerful, powerful realized being. So even if we're able to liberate from samsara, it's not the end of the path from a Mahayana perspective, but it's not something to belittle. That's the point I'm trying to make, right? But from the Mahayana Buddhist perspective, it's much more skillful to develop bodhicitta, which is a much wider connection and relationship to emptiness based on the aspiration to awaken all beings, right? Which in itself is a paradox. So already when we start to talk about relative bodhicitta, we're already starting to talk about the paradox of emptiness, just right away. I think if we don't acknowledge that, relative bodhicitta, it runs the risk of simply just sort of another worldly dharma, right? And I'll give some reasons for that later. But basically, we have this paradox of that, sentient beings are endless from the Mahayana perspective, yet we're aspiring here to become awakened in order to free them. So there's these four great Zen vows in the Zen Mahayana tradition. And they say, one of the Zen vows is sentient beings are limitless, I vow to free them. So I just want you to think about that for a second. Sentient beings are limitless, I vow to free them, right? The phrase in itself is meant to break the conceptual mind. It's not meant to be understood, right? It's meant to break our conceptual mind. And the same with the teachings, we're going to explore tonight on relative bodhicitta. Yet, even though there's this paradox, there's also a path. There's a path of developing relative bodhicitta, right? So what does bodhicitta mean? It just means the awakened mind. And bodhicitta has two aspects to it, or two sides. It has the relative side we're talking about now, which is growing both aspiration and engagement in a mind that wishes to see beings be free. And that's based on compassion, and that's based on love, right? So we also train in boundless love and boundless compassion. And so it's an altruism based in seeing reality clearer, right? And so that's the side of bodhicitta we're going to talk about tonight. But there's the other side of bodhicitta we're going to talk about next week, which is the side of Buddhist non-duality, or emptiness, right? So embedded in the relative is the absolute. Embedded in the absolute is the relative. But when we're training in it through this text, we're kind of going a little more linear, in a linear fashion. We're developing the relative aspect as a way to embrace the absolute aspect of bodhicitta, or the practice of emptiness. They're synonymous. So it's really, how do you say? So relative Okay, now here's an interesting one. So there's many ways to try to describe relative or absolute, but what do we really mean? Relative means something that is actually not true. I don't mean to be confusing here, but I'm going to start a little more in the deep end and then come back to the shallow end. It really means something that's not true, yeah, the table my computer is sitting on is relative. It's a relative truth because it depends on other things to exist, right? You know, the fact of it being big or small really depends on the perceiver, right? Like, is my table big or, I know you can't see it, but well, let's do something you can see. Okay, this microphone. Is this microphone big or small? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but to us, it's small, right? Because, you know, our body's much bigger. But to an ant, it's pretty big, right? So that's the relative truth of this microphone, right? So the bigness or smallness of this microphone, it depends. It's interdependent. It's in relationship. And therefore, the bigness or smallness doesn't exist truly. We can't say the microphone is truly small or truly big, but yet it still appears to us in relationship to our experience, right? So that's one way to discuss relative. Its absolute nature is that we can't find the bigness or smallness, right? But again, that's next week. I'm just sort of flirting with it this week. So the same with relative bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta initially it's conceptual states of mind and qualities of feeling and emotion that we're developing, right? So I'm pointing this out because it's not abstract. What we're developing in the practice is based on boundless love, boundless compassion, and altruism. We're generating a very strong aspiration embedded in love and compassion to free all beings, right? And, you know, we could say emotionally, that's a complex emotion. It's not a single emotion. And conceptually, we can say there's also a spark for insight there. Because like I said, even that thought, all sentient beings, I mean, what does that even mean to you or me? You know, that's a big idea, right? I mean, do we even know what all sentient beings are? I mean, we got 8 billion human beings on the planet. Has anybody done a consensus on the amount of animals on the planet? There's no way. I mean, I don't even think we have a number to count that, right? Talking about ants and bugs and, you know, microscopic things and all that. Could we actually count the amount of animals? No. And that's just one portion of the sentient beings that supposedly make up samsara, right? Now, do they make up samsara? Not really. It's just a way to say it. Samsara is their experience of mind right now that produced a certain body, right? But anyways, it's just kind of a semantic thing. So right away, we're flirting with big ideas. We're talking about very big ideas, and we're talking about concepts that actually break concept eventually. So what we have to do in the practice level is start practical. You know, we're developing boundless equanimity, the four immeasurables, boundless or immeasurable equanimity, immeasurable love, immeasurable compassion. If we have time, we'll do some practice. I'm not sure if we will. But this is the practice I'll recommend to practice this week, is the four immeasurables, you know, generating equanimity, generating boundless or immeasurable love, immeasurable compassion, and immeasurable joy. And then from there, we develop a sense of responsibility, right? And from there, we develop this aspirational bodhicitta. Now, there's this other side to relative bodhicitta called engaging bodhicitta. And that's really embedded in the 6 paramitas, the practice of the 6 paramitas. And again, just giving you a little bit of, you know, nuance to reflect on. It's more next week, though. The 6 paramitas become paramitas because of the 6th, the paramita of wisdom. So now we start to see, like, again, we might not understand all this, and that's okay. But we have to understand what we're pointing to, meaning, like, at least understand the process of what we need to then put into practice, right? So the paramita of wisdom is the wisdom of emptiness, the 3rd principal aspect of the path. And then generosity, ethics, patience, perseverance, and meditation are embraced by that. So what that also says is most of us are not ready to start with engaging bodhicitta. We need to start with aspiring bodhicitta. And that's what we're really talking about tonight. And as I said, inspiring bodhicitta is based on boundless love, boundless compassion, and the altruistic responsibility or intention. And there's many ways, to generate bodhicitta. We practice the four immeasurables, like I say, we meditate on those. We also work with practices like Tonglen. That's a way to generate bodhicitta as well over time. And then there's one called the 7-point cause and effect instruction. There's many styles and ways to do it. But the idea of it being relative is that we're using our conceptual mind to develop it. So in a way, this is kind of like safe territory for a lot of us, because, what are we doing? We're training the conceptual mind to move away from self-obsession, to move away from what I like to think of as the small self that always is thinking about itself, always concerned with such and such a thought, such and such an emotion, such and such a pain, and then neglects others, or our relationship to others is only in relationship to self. And it's not like me or you or anyone is a bad person for that. That in itself is samsara, right? So like, if we didn't have self-obsession, you would be liberated to a certain extent, right? So I just want to point that out. We don't have to feel bad about that, but we do have to understand it as an aspect of suffering, an aspect of pain. So one reflection I do a lot is sort of recognize when I'm becoming very self-preoccupied into that small self, I look at my experience. I sit with my embodied experience and I sit with that. Is that fun? I ask myself the question, is that enjoyable? Is that fun? Is that pleasurable, or is that unpleasurable? And pretty much 100% of the time, if I ask that question, it's unpleasurable, right? There's some tension there. There's something, for me, a lot of my anxiety is connected to this. Like all the time, 100% of the time, if I ask the question, why am I anxious? Oh, because I'm worried I'm not going to get such and such, or I'm worried such and such will go away, or I'm worried whatever, right? So we could see, yet this beast of the small self, it's very strong. It's one of the strongest habitual patterns for us. So we have to be kind, because that's not us, right? But we also have to be diligent in our practice to remove it. And what really helps to work with that and to counter the small self or self-obsession, what we're sharing tonight, these practices of relative bodhicitta, right? And so in verse 6, I'm just sort of pointing out the larger picture, and then we'll come back to this, what I was just saying. But so in verse 6, Lama Tsongkhapa is really pointing out just this fact from a Mahayana perspective, that we can't attain enlightenment without bodhicitta. We can attain arhatship, but that's not full enlightenment. At some point, the person who attains liberation or becomes a Shravakyana arhat, they realize they're not fully enlightened, and then they need to do more work. So in the Mahayana sutras and teachings, they say, well, why bother? Just go for the full thing. Go for bodhicitta from the start. It's an easier path in a sense. It's a swifter way to enlightenment. And, if you just look at the lives of some beings who made bodhicitta the focus of their life, you really see the value of it. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying you see the value. So, our main guru of our centers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, one of the main gurus of our centers, he made his whole life about bodhicitta. I was thinking about him today. I wasn't there when he died, obviously, just recently, but I was thinking about his death, and I was thinking about how easily he died. I don't mean like physically. I mean like, he had some breathing problems. He came down from the altitude, right? They want to go to the hospital. He didn't want to go to the hospital. I don't know if he complained to Venerable Raja. I don't know what happened. I doubt he complained. Maybe he said something. If they asked him, he said about his breathing. I don't know. I didn't hear detail like that. But my guess is it was like going from one, I don't know, like when you change your clothes, that's how it felt. Lama Zopa died. And this is the quality of a realized yogi who's realized bodhicitta. Why? Because there's no self to protect at that point. There's no sense of like, oh, I'm dying now, get me a doctor and a this such and such comfortable bed and this and this. It's just sort of like, You know, many yogis die in very simple ways, you know. They don't die with like a lot of elaborate, unless it's kind of like a prolonged illness, and then their monks and nuns or their sangha might, you know, in order to earn merit or to accumulate merit with the Lama, they might, you know, of course, serve them if they're having a more prolonged death process. But yeah, it's just like Lama Zopa Rinpoche just changed clothes. And to me, it's not an expression. Well, yes, it's an expression of his realization of emptiness, but it's mainly an expression of his bodhicitta, right? Because his just full dedication to awakening for the benefit of others, right? So we can see the power of it. Patra Rinpoche, who's a very famous lineage Lama in the Nyingma tradition, he said, if we only have one thing, the preciousness of bodhicitta is enough, right? So sometimes it's really useful to reflect on these kind of quotes, you know. Sure, like using it as a devotional quote is fine too, but I think it's much more interesting to reflect, like, why would he say that? Why is bodhicitta enough? Okay, this is homework. Write the quote down. If we have only one thing, the precious bodhicitta is enough. And then the quote goes on to say, if we have nothing else, we must have the method of precious bodhicitta, right? That's the full quote. And so, you know, why would he say such a thing? So in wherever you're at with these teachings, I want you to answer that for yourself, you know, by the end of tonight, or, you know, for next week, we can talk about that if I remember. One of you can remind me if I forget. But, you know, try to answer that for yourself. Why is it precious? Now, I'm not saying you need to come up with the answer or be definitive about that. Just an answer according to where you're at right now with the teachings, your understanding, right? Like for me, this is an open question. You know what I mean by that? Like, I have ideas why he's saying that, and I know the preciousness of bodhicitta in my practice in my life, but I'm also using the question to dig deeper. That's also what I'm suggesting for some of you kind of longer term practitioners. You know, dig deeper a little bit. Like, what does this really, you know, what does this mean to you? Okay. Also, Shanti Deva said, if you stir milk, butter arises. Likewise, if you stir the teachings, the Dharma, its essence is bodhicitta. Bodhi mind arises, right? So really, some of these quotes are helpful in just remembering the simplicity of this too, because there's so much Dharma to study. There's a lot of things to practice, you know? But I don't know, I was thinking about it today, not only Lama Zopa Rinpoche, but also a few of my other lamas who I've, you know, taken as refuges and lamas over the years. All of them really, they get to a certain point where all they do is really emphasize bodhicitta. You know, like they could be really skilled in other teachings, like, you know, be able to really give impeccable, detailed teachings on emptiness, or, you know, give tantric empowerments, or, you know, describe the mandalas of those empowerments, or give teachings on how to practice such and such a deity or tumo or all these things. But what do they come back to? They come back to bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta. That's what they could. And, you know, it never confused me. It actually made me feel guilty, to be honest, because I never felt like, I always wanted the higher thing, like, oh, I really want to understand emptiness, or I really want to get this in such and such a teaching. And then, like I said, eventually you come back to, there's a point where they were doing all that. It's because without bodhicitta, none of it matters. The rest doesn't matter at all, actually. Right? So we have and bodhicitta here, I would say, also includes the wisdom aspect of emptiness. But we have this quote that says, you know, wisdom without method. Relative bodhicitta is really in the method aspects of the Dharma, the skillful means aspect. If wisdom is devoid of method, it's bondage. If method is devoid of wisdom, it's also bondage. So what it's saying is these two things have to go together. So we're not saying relative bodhicitta alone. Actually, relative bodhicitta connects with absolute bodhicitta. They're just two sides of one coin, in my view. But if we're not developing the relative bodhicitta side, something is missing. You know, something gets missed in the path, right? Okay, so let's look at verse 7. So now we're going to talk about how to generate the mind of enlightenment. We talked a little bit about what it is. So verse 7 says, beings are swept along by the powerful current of the four rivers, tightly bound by the chains of their karma so difficult to undo, ensnared within the iron trap of their self-grasping, and enshrouded in thick darkness, in the thick darkness of ignorance. I'm going to go on to verse 8. Again and yet again, they are reborn in limitless samsara and constantly tormented by the three forms of suffering. This is the current condition of all your mothers from previous lives. Contemplate their plight and generate supreme bodhicitta. Okay. So this is really where Lama Tsongkhapa leaves, he just has these three verses on bodhicitta here, on relative bodhicitta. But here, he's giving a very pithy instruction on how to generate bodhicitta. So I already, recommended different methods. We develop the four immeasurables. We develop, the 7-point cause and effect instruction. We have also Tonglen and different things. But if the key point isn't understood, the key point being what he's saying in verse 7 and 8, if that's not understood in our practice and we don't know how to implement that, it doesn't mean Tonglen is going to go the right direction, or any of this is going to go the right direction, right? Tonglen can actually go the wrong direction in particular. So I was doing a whole last few weeks in my group mentoring course. We're doing the 37 practices of a bodhisattva, and he's got Togme Sampo, the author of that text, has a lot of verses on Tonglen. And so what I ended up talking about was sort of like where sometimes the popular version of Tonglen becomes a way to soothe ourselves rather than to undermine our small self or self-obsession. For those of you who don't know what Tonglen is, don't worry. I'm talking to those of you who do. Tonglen is for those of you who don't, Tonglen is a practice where we mount on the breath, where we imagine taking on the problems and suffering and pain of others, and then on the in-breath and on the exhalation, we offer them all of our wealth, health, goodness, joy, etc. Now, this has become a popular practice because, well, I think it's simple and it's intuitive. A lot of people don't remember the first two parts, though. That's based on first meditating on equanimity, and then second, meditating that all beings have been our mothers. So then we engage in the giving and taking, right? So it depends on this. We can talk about that if you want, this sense of, it's one of the key teachings of developing relative bodhicitta is recognizing all beings having been our mothers, or maybe in a modern way, we can say recognizing we have relationships with all beings, and they've been incredibly kind to us in those relationships. So then we reciprocate as we generate aspirational bodhicitta. But anyways, we can talk about that later if you want. So Tonglen can go the wrong direction. Why? Because, let's say you see, I'll just give you an example. Let's say you see, a homeless guy on the street, and it disturbs you to a certain extent. I'm not saying like he disturbs you. I just mean it disturbs you that there's a homeless person, and there's this lack of ability to be with that disturbing nature, and you want to get rid of it. You want to get rid of the disturbance in your mind. You want to get rid of the feeling of, shit, I feel kind of guilty because I'm in my house, and and look at this guy on the street. I wish I could help him more, but let's do Tonglen for him, right? Now, is that like totally bad? No, because you want to generate love and compassion, but it's missing the entire point of Tonglen, right? Because what's happening is you're just soothing yourself. So I'm being a little bit, intense here, but I just want to say that because a lot of popular Tonglen, when we don't understand the underlying nature of how to do the practice, it can go in the direction of reifying the self, just sort of using it as a tool to soothe ourselves rather than a tool to actually undermine our self-clinging and our self-obsession. So I personally think Tonglen is an advanced practice for that reason. I don't know. I think it took me about 15 years to really understand what Tonglen is and how to practice it, right? And I know that's a little bit provocative and controversial, but we all have maybe it doesn't for you. I hope it doesn't. But for me, it took a long time because Tonglen should disturb us. Why? because it should hit that ego clinging that doesn't want the cancer of someone else, that doesn't want, to experience that. So just a little shortcut. I usually recommend, if you want to practice a more authentic Tonglen, well, it needs to be based on equanimity and recognizing all beings having been our mothers. But then when we move to giving and taking, work with something that's personal. Work with something that is a pain point for you, right? Meaning, like, if you have a head cold, work with taking on the head colds of others. Work with giving away all of your health and medicine and, all of that. So work with something that's personal. That's how I find Tonglen to be really helpful. Otherwise, it kind of bypasses something, We do it for the homeless guy on the street, but we don't have a connection to being homeless. That's not a pain point for us. So it does nothing for him. It's much better to just, give him food or whatever, whatever he needs. Anyways, so anyways, besides those techniques, sorry, I got into a little bit into the weeds there, I apologize. But besides these techniques of four measurables, Tonglen, all of that, Lama Tsongkhapa is really pointing out the main thing here. And that is this reflection. Actually, you could use this verse as a way to meditate on relative bodhicitta. I usually meditate on relative bodhicitta more in line with what he's saying here. I do Tonglen and all these other practices too. I find it more powerful, this kind of thinking that he's giving here. So let's just kind of go sentence by sentence. Beings are swept along by the powerful current of the four rivers. So what are the four rivers? These are birth, old age, sickness, and death, right? It's what the Buddha saw, right? When he in the myth of the Buddha, when he escaped the palace, when he didn't listen to his father and he escaped, he saw birth, old age, sickness, and death, and that caused him to renounce the palace. That caused him to renounce clinging, basically, and then he went on his path as a mendicant. So beings are swept along by birth, old age, sickness, and death, tightly bound by the chains of their karma, so difficult to undo, ensnared within the iron trap of their self-grasping, and enshrouded in the thick darkness of ignorance. So it's going from more gross to subtle here, right? But essentially what he's pointing to is just what we were reflecting on last week, right? So now we kind of see why renunciation mind is so important. It's not just important because we want to be clear that we're in a certain predicament where suffering runs deep for us, and we want to we become weary of that, and we want to exit that kind of confusion of samsara. But when we're developing bodhicitta, it depends on how much we meditated on our own samsaric nature. Really, it all comes back to this. If we don't do the work of looking at the three types of suffering in our own life, how are we going to want others to exit them? We're not even going to know the extent to what others are going through. So in a way, it all comes back to one's own house, one's own side of the tracks, is what I like to say, right? Even when we're developing bodhicitta. Because at this point, we're taking all of the reflection. I think you could take the verse off, Gina, thanks. At this point, even when we're doing all, because of all the reflection we've done on that, we're also bound by the four rivers, birth, old age, sickness, and death. We're also bound by by karma, cause, and effect. We're also, as I was just pointing out, we have to do some investigation. Self-grasping could also be what I was saying, self-obsession. We're mostly preoccupied with ourselves. And then fourth, it's talking about the most subtle, the thickness of misperception, or marikpa in Tibetan, right? Which is the opposite of emptiness. We'll talk about that more next week. But we have to recognize these in our life. Now, okay, this also has its own sidetracks. So this is why I want to say this carefully, because even when I point out that we're self-grasping or self-obsessed, some people will go, when I say that, some people go into their mind, either they'll reject what I'm saying because it's hurtful, or they'll go into their mind thinking they're bad, right? I did this, so maybe some of you are doing this. When I heard these teachings initially, I thought, I felt not quite shame, but like little bit of guilt and some sense of like sin, you know, that I'm screwed up or something. That's not what this is saying at all, right? All of this is based on I think I said this last week, all of this is based on the Buddhist principle of Buddha nature, that our essential nature is free. Our essential nature is not stained by any of this. All of this is happening because of a misperception that has nothing to do with you fundamentally. So that has to click. That's a really important thing to reflect on. Otherwise, we could take our self-grasping as me, and then it takes us further into self-grasping. We could take this sense of the four rivers as happening to me. And I'm going to give you kind of like a modern way to think about this. It's sort of an analogy I've been using lately in teachings, and I'll just go with it. You know, it's more like a pop culture analogy. So we all are kind of like getting exposure to some degree to virtual reality, that there's some future to this in human technology and possibly human life, right? Like, you know, when Apple's scaring me now, by the way, but that's for another kind of, you know, talk. When Apple comes out with a product and puts I'm assuming billions of dollars into creating a product, they didn't do that out of nowhere. It means it's something. It means it's going to be something in society that's going to be bought and used, etc. Anyways, so for what, you know, we don't have to get in an argument if that's good or not or whatever. That's a separate issue. But the Dharma's been saying this for 2,600 years. It's not a new thing. We already are in virtual reality. We already have virtual reality goggles on, and it's called our human body, right? So this creates a whole nother way to look at, we're going to talk about it more in relation to emptiness, but even when we're talking about this way of how we experience samsara, it's happening through a virtual reality suit, through our five senses, our brain, our physiology, the mind being kind of caught in the enclosure or the cage of this human physiology. And this human physiology, even though we can use it to wake up, it's an incredibly precious thing. It also is a thing that is coloring our experience. So often in Tibetan Buddhist teachings, they'll use analogies like someone with jaundice. Some of you have heard that, where, you know, when someone has advanced jaundice, everything becomes colored, it becomes like yellowish. Or, you know, a modern example might be like colored glasses, where everything becomes purplish or bluish or something. Now, just imagine, it's kind of like, this has the potential to, I'm not saying I'm going to wake you up. I'm saying reflecting on this has the potential to wake you up if you reflect on this carefully. Imagine your body now as a VR goggle. Just for a second, just a split second. How does that change your relationship to what's around you? Life. Your thoughts are also part of that VR goggle set, right? And it's so immersive that we fooled ourselves into thinking this is who we are. On a very fundamental level. It's not like we think about that. We act based on that. You know, we react based on this sense of self. You know, if someone calls your name, oh, hey, yeah, hey, honey, you know, if someone pricks you with a needle, oh, they prick me with a needle. There's not even the word me, there's the thought me. There's the whole subconscious thing happening. Now, that's this bondage Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about. That's this, you know, these four rivers, the karma so difficult to undo, self-grasping. And that doesn't make us bad. It makes us VR goggle wearers who don't know we have VR on. You see what I'm saying? How does that change this relationship for you? It really changed it for me. It clicked the other day in meditation. I was just like, I'm a VR goggle wearer. And that VR set I'm so used to it, it's habituating everything I'm doing. And then even my thoughts trick me. You know, I get angry at something that it doesn't exist, and I get angry at it, you know? And so what does this bring? Compassion, kindness, softness. Don't have to feel guilty. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. But no one's going to take the responsibility for you taking your damn VR goggles off. No one can do that for you. Only you can do that, right? So what is that like? We understand we're in this mechanism that's causing suffering. We can't, there is no way out, literally. I mean, this is kind of the harshness of the renunciation mind teachings. There's no way out, but there's a way in, right? There's a way in. And what is the way in? Meditating on the Dharma, growing the weariness of renunciation mind, cultivating relative bodhicitta. And then emptiness is truly cultivating emptiness and realizing emptiness. That's when the VR goggles start to come off, right? You know, this is a little, this gets into some complexity, but anyways, we can talk about that if you have questions. But I just wanted to point this out right now because for me, this changes how I think of it. That when I get caught into a pattern of self-obsession, it has nothing to do with me being good or bad. It's literally just a pattern. It's a habit. I'll give you another example. When you get a head cold, do you take that personally? Maybe some of us do, but let's just talk, generally. Do you take that personally? Are you like, you're talking to your husband, wife, partner, whatever. Honey, I got a cold. I'm such a terrible human being. I'm such a shitty Buddhist. I got a cold now, Nobody says that. Nobody says that. Why? Because it's just a physiological thing happening to the body. So why do we take our emotions and thoughts so personal? Yes, we need to it's okay to diagnose things and take responsibility for things and recognize, yeah, okay, I have such and such a trauma, but then we want to reify that. We want to make that an identity, a personality. From the Buddhist perspective, that's a huge mistake, right? Because then we have no way out of it. It's become, we've locked it into a sense of solidity and permanence. Anyways, so this verse 7, when we're doing the work to recognize the things here that it's talking about, karma is a big one. It's a big one to reflect on. It's too much to go into here, but it's a big one. And then the darkness of marikpa, or misperception, right? The misperception that we think the VR suit is self. That's really one of the main ways we misperceive. We think this human experience is self, but it's not. And so when we develop this sense of the confusion that's going on in relation to our own suffering, verse 7 then applies to developing compassion for others. That's why I'm saying, if we don't generate compassion for ourselves through renunciation mind, when we use it as a punishment, we can't develop bodhicitta. It's like the road is blocked. It becomes a sidetrack, right? So I hope this is clicking. It's based on relating to our own suffering, understanding that our own suffering is not self, yet it's caused, and that we can eliminate that cause. We can eliminate those causes. Basic Buddhism, Four Noble Truths, right? Then we can start to develop bodhicitta for others. Why? Because they're also in VR suits, and they don't know they're in VR suits. Okay, now coming to a traditional example. I used it last night in the group mentoring class. I think a lot of us have kids here. Yeah, I have a small daughter, but so some of you might not have kids. So you can think of your niece or nephew or something, or a pet. So imagine you kind of hear crying or whimpering if it's a pet or something, in the middle of the night, and you go over and you realize your dog or your son or your daughter or your niece or nephew is having a nightmare, right? And not only are they having a nightmare, but because of the nightmare, they're sweating profusely and they're soaking wet, right? There's their body physically reacted to it, but they're still in the dream, right? So what do? There's the relative option where we can, bring a cool towel for their forehead. We can change their clothes if we need to, right? This is all the worldly things we can do for others, right? But what do you feel with that? You feel the sense of responsibility. They're your son, they're your daughter, they're your pet, your niece or nephew. We feel this sense of God, I wish they would wake up from that nightmare, right? God, I wish they could understand that. And then the sweating can stop and they can come out and realize it's just a dream. This is how the Buddhists feel towards us. Literally, it's how they feel. So the Buddhists will manifest, Bodhisattvas will manifest to change our clothes, so to speak, to help us with the sweating. But really, they're trying to teach us how to wake up from the nightmare, or the dream. Could be a good dream too. They're trying to wake up, teach us how to do that. And that's what bodhicitta is. right? That's what bodhicitta is. It's both the wish to relieve the suffering of sentient beings, in this case, the sweating represents like, the worldly problems of people, right? Of ourselves, of others, etc. But the dreaming represents the samsaric, the fundamental problem of samsara. Here he says, and enshrouded in the thick darkness of ignorance, right? That represents the nightmare, the dream state where we think it's real. We think the VR human body is real. And it is real, but it's not true. There's an illusion happening through it and because of it. So now we're starting to see what bodhicitta actually means, the profundity of the wish we're developing. And why can we develop this wish? Because it's the essence of our mind. Bodhicitta itself is the essence of Buddha nature, the essence of mind, right? So all along, while we're in this VR suit, the thing that's moving from VR suit to VR suit in samsara, from life to life, already it carries the keys to get out of the prison. This is the good news, right? I've mainly been pointing out the bad news. This is the good news. The keys to the prison are in the prison. We just have to look back at the prison cell. That's why I was saying the practice of Buddha Dharma is to look, is to be, is to go in, not out, right? And we do that gradually through lots of different practices. But now we see the profundity of what it means to aspire to awaken for the benefit of all beings. It has nothing to do with being a hero. It has nothing to do with being a good person. It has everything to do with uncovering reality as it is. Because right now, within the mind that's perceiving samsara is also the mind perceiving nirvana. Sorry, a little bit of tantric Buddhism now, but I think it's helpful because it's useful to think this, right? I'm not giving anything secret. It's just, we have to, even if it doesn't make sense, you have to use this as something to think about. The mind itself liberates itself. So the keys to that are also in the mind. They can't be anywhere else. All the Dharma is doing, all I'm doing, all anything, any teacher or any teaching is doing is pointing us back to that. That's all it is. And so when we're developing relative bodhicitta, we're developing the wish to do that, but also to point others to that in lots of skillful ways. It doesn't have to always be through teaching the Dharma. Even the Buddha stayed silent sometimes. So silence can also point people to enlightenment, right? So then in verse 8, again and yet again, they're reborn in limitless samsara and constantly tormented by the three forms of suffering. This is the current condition of all your mothers from previous lives. Contemplate their plight and generate supreme bodhicitta. So the same thing I'm saying here. As we contemplate our plight, we are contemplating their plight. And that's what bodhicitta is based on. That's how we generate it. So for me personally, these two verses are enough. I just reflect on these on a daily basis. And primarily in verse 8, when he says the three forms of suffering, that's the meditation I like to use, where I meditate on these three types of suffering in my own life. And then I remember others around me are experiencing that. And these are the suffering of change, and then what's called all-pervasive suffering. So the suffering is like the sweating, right? In the example I use, it's the gross emotional and physical suffering we go through and others go through. And that varies, right? Some people have more of that, some people have less. Or I could say we have different versions of that, maybe. I was talking to a mentee yesterday about this, that often these days it's very popular. I call it the suffering Olympics, where, I don't mean to be derogatory to anyone, but, this sense of like, there's this competition for who's suffering the most, I think people even are like make up new identities to then, identify themselves as suffering more than another person, another group, right? I don't want to go into the weeds with that, just an opinion. I don't think it's so helpful at the end of the day. Now, systems that oppress people, that's a little different. Those need to be remedied, right? So we're not, I just want to be careful the words I'm using here. Those are real, right? We need to work with those and remedy that. But the suffering of one individual is not necessarily more than the suffering of another. We were talking about the difference between like someone who's poverty-stricken versus rich, I don't know. I mostly work with people with kind of like problems stemming from, they're not poor, I'll put it that way, right? So poor in a financial sense. And in a way, I also live primarily in countries where there's high poverty rates compared to the United States, where there's a bigger gap between rich and poor. And what I notice is, I'm not saying the sufferings are equal, they're different, And so, often I meet people in very, very meager financial circumstances with just a lot of emotional joy, a lot of emotional, how do you say it? Stability and perseverance. They're hard workers. They love their family. There's other things they rely on. Where then, some of my richer students, struggle because they can't even get along with their kids, or they're always suffering with anxiety and depression because they're stuck in their own thoughts. But they have everything they need around them. And I'm not trying to insult anyone. I'm just saying, could we say someone is suffering more than another? No, they're just experiencing different kinds of suffering. Yet this is within that first type of suffering. The suffering, I was trying to think, how did I go on this tangent? This is within the suffering of suffering. The suffering of change is a little more subtle. And this is really useful to reflect on. This is the sense that the moment we feel relief from, let's say, standing up from sitting down for a long time, that relief is the start of the suffering of standing up. The moment we sit down from walking around for a long time, that sitting down is the relief from standing up. And this applies to a lot of different things. And, it's a hard one because it brings into question what we call pleasure. It's not a popular one. This is the reason I'm, I think I'm not like a, number one mindful. I'm just joking, but, people don't like to hear this. Let me just put it that way, but it's the truth when we look at it. But we all have to find that own truth in ourselves. We have to do the work. And it's hard work because we have to look at our mind and our emotions and our experience of pain and pleasure. So the suffering of change is more related to that because it shows us a deeper layer of what we normally label as pleasurable, that actually it's when we're clinging to it, it's usually a part of the dukkha experience, the suffering experience. And then all pervasive suffering, it relates more to the VR I was talking about. Like just birth in itself is the start of this new VR suit that creates its own confusion, that, it's really hard to get out of the VR because we don't know we're in VR. And that would be more like the all-pervasive suffering. Though there's another kind of simpler way to think of it, I like from Mingyur Rinpoche, where he says, it's this feeling of never, like this kind of subtle feeling that things aren't quite all right. Like they could be all right for a little while and we're kind of settled, but then something comes up in our body and mind that feels like something's not right. I need to do this or do that or whatever. And it's very subtle, right? It's very subtle. So he was saying kind of like just that sense that like, I need to do something, right? That's the all-pervasive suffering. Okay. So let's do some Q&A, but that's basically it. I really recommend reflecting on verse 7 and 8. It's so beautiful because you can use it as a way to reflect on renunciation mind and relative bodhicitta. So you first start with yourself, 3 types of suffering, or just the other words or other meaning in verse 7 and 8. Start with yourself and then start to think about the others around you. Now, we don't know definitively, but we can infer it, right? Because we're not experiencing other people's experience, but we can infer it based off what they tell us, based off their body language. We can infer, we're in our own VR experience, but we can also, because of our VR, we can see the VR of other people, right? Does that make sense? It's kind of trippy because we normally think we're experiencing the same world. We're not. We're just in a virtual reality world, experiencing our individual perception of that. So this is just 101, Dharma 101. I'm just using new languaging to talk about it. But it's really trippy when you think about that. It's like, because a lot of the times we can see so many social issues and so many things are based on an assumption that we're all having an objective experience. And that is the same. A lot of arguments are like that. Pretty much all my arguments with my wife are like that. It's like, No, it's like this. No, it's like that. No, but we're each having our own perception. And then there's a common locus of what we call in the Dharma. I mean, it's a English word, but consensus. Where yes, this is a spoon. The other person agrees, but we're not seeing the same spoon. But yet we have a consensus on what spoon is. And that gets us into trouble, right? So anyways, I'm going a little into the deep end. Just some little teasers and Easter eggs for next week. So yeah, what do you all have in your minds? What's coming up for you? Just kind of go for it. Ling.
Yeah, I have two big questions, and I don't know if you can even answer them, but we'll try. All right. How do we, if this is all like virtual reality, I guess my first question is, does karma cause this virtual reality that we see? We imbue with it.
Well, karma is it's just a subset of cause and effect, and it's kind of like feeds back on itself. So yes, yeah, I could say yes, but there's like a little bit of a caveat there because we're causing the karma in a sense.
Right.
Because karma just means action. So when we take an action based on a belief in our VR, it has a ripple. It has an effect in the body, speech, and mind, in both now and the future.
Right.
And so it's kind of like it's perpetuating the VR. So it's kind of like the VR, because we misperceive that VR is self.
Mhm.
The human, the perception is self, the thoughts are self, etc. We accumulate karma based on afflictive emotions, and then because of that, it kind of reinforces later on when the karma comes to fruit, when the fruition of karma happens. We're talking about specific karma now. This is billions, of karmic reactions in each of our minds. I mean, countless. Then it kind of reinforces it, because the habit pattern of reification comes along with it.
Can I ask one more part?
Sure. Yeah.
So how does Buddhism explain, if we're all like Buddha mind underneath all of this, and that's who we really are, then how the heck do we get into samsara to begin with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, well, usually Mahayana Buddhism answers it by saying there's no beginning. So they don't assert a beginning to time, right? This gets a little more into the emptiness teachings, because what it really means is like time is also an illusion. Time is a relative construct, right? I like to think of this a little bit more, because again, the teachings, we have to look at this also coming from cultures that were non-literal sometimes, because we come from a very literal culture right now, and this gets us into trouble, because when we read the Dharma, we assume that's where they're coming from. But actually, a lot of, they use myth and symbol and art and all kinds of other things as ways to understand experience, but it's not always literal.
Right.
So when they say beginningless time, my take is that beginningless time, which would also mean endless, is happening. It's not correct to say now, because there's also not now, but it's happening simultaneously. This is when it gets a little bit into like extreme deep end, Buddhism. And again, this is just kind of like my way of voicing it. This isn't a traditional take on it, but it seems like when you get into the more advanced Buddhist teachings, we find in Tantric Buddhism, it's really talking about a samsara that's perpetuating. It looks like one dream going to the next, but it's the same dream. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's a little David Lynchy, a little like what's that Netflix show, Black Mirror. But it's kind of, if you take out all the weird horror stuff, it's kind of like that's what it means, beginningless, right? So it's like so the analogy of a dream versus waking up from a dream is, I think, a little bit easier to understand here. It's like we're in a perpetual dream, and when we wake up from the dream, all there is this recognition that dream was an illusion. That's it, right? It doesn't mean things stop to existing either. They stop existing as a dream. Okay. So karma is part of that dream. Maybe that's helpful for your question too. Karma is not ultimately real. It's a part of the dream too. But the problem is when we're in the dream, we got to respect it. As my teacher, Sonia Rinpoche says, well, we're still dreaming in samsara. You better, we got to watch so we don't create a nightmare, right? That's what he says, right? So you can create a nightmare with your karma. So that's why they say, like, mind your karma. But ultimately, the point is, like, whether it's virtuous karma or non-virtuous, it's still bondage. I mean, there's sutras that point that out directly. It's still like a chain to a certain extent. And it's part of the dream. So the karma, to answer your question more specifically, based on everything I just said, it seems like karma there was no beginning to karma because there's no beginning to dream. It just is, that's why samsara, the word samsara literally means to circle.
Right.
It's very apt here because it's describing something that's circular, not that's linear, right? And when we understand it as circular, we see there's a way out too, because there's no past, future, or present. There's just this, what we call fourth time sometimes, time beyond time. And when we recognize, now this is talking about emptiness, right? We're really next week. That's what emptiness means. It's just connecting with the nature of mind, the nature of reality that's not within past, present, or future. And that wakes us up from the dream, not all at once, but gradually. Anyways, I probably confuse you more, but.
No, I sort of understand what you're saying. It's just like, it sounds like it's one big long dream, and the idea is to get into a better dream in the end, like Parcheesi or something. We're all in the better dream.
No, the idea is to wake up from the dream, right? Like,
but then that's the good thing, right? Then you're in the Buddha.
No, yeah, I think it's okay to think about it like that for now, because sometimes we don't have a way to conceptualize this, but that's not also what's happening.
Okay.
In a way, this is where our kind of like human concept can't understand. That's why when we have insight into emptiness, that's when it starts to click. But it's not something you can conceptual, because emptiness isn't a concept. So when we connect with it, you start to see what this means, but that is not another thing, because emptiness isn't a thing either, right? It's actually, here's another way to think of it. And by the way, you should be confused with this. This is like I'm confused with this. I'm just sharing some ideas on it. You know what I mean? Like, right, this is confusing because it doesn't conceptually make any sense. But just another way to think of it, because it'll help also with next week. Emptiness is just the removal of it's the removal of misperception. It's not the seeing of something different. It's more like we're unobscuring something. We're uncovering something because it's already there. Because it's just like, if emptiness isn't a thing or it's not something separate, it's the nature of everything. The difference when it comes to mind is that the mind has an aspect that can know. We're like, the emptiness of our sentience, or the emptiness of mind in the sense of who we think we are. That emptiness is not different than a computer, or table, or a microphone. It's just the microphone doesn't. Sorry, man. If I'm insulting this microphone, it doesn't have a mind, so it can't know. So we can know emptiness, but that knowing is non-conceptual, meaning it goes beyond time. Yeah, it goes beyond the dream, but beyond the dream doesn't mean another dream, like a better dream. That's more the kind of like sin, virtue, heaven, and hell model, right? And I think beginning in Buddhism, like, it's okay to think that. There's a lot of cultural Buddhists who that's kind of how they relate to it, like nirvana is some kind of heaven kind of thing. But when you really study the teachings, that's not what it's talking about, at all. But, we can also, if that inspires us to practice, great. You know what I mean? Like, it's fine. Yeah.
Go ahead, have your dream. Thank you.
I mean, we all need something to inspire us, to practice. Because emptiness isn't nothingness either. Because some people can think like, oh, that sounds very like dark and nihilistic. It's actually the opposite of dark and nihilistic. It's just hard to understand. It's hard to grok. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, actually, quite good questions. Very, very, very deep, actually. Yeah. I'm okay to go over if there's more questions. So, we can go over for a few minutes. I don't know you all. Gina, do you have a few minutes?
I'm good.
Sure.
I want to-
Fernando.
yes. I
Dime,
wanted to
por
ask a bit.
favor.
Well, I could
Dime,
say
dime.
it in Spanish.
Dale.
It's in relation to choleric bodhicitta. Because I've been thinking about Amitabha. I mean, at some point he ended up emanating as Haryagriva because a demon was going to destroy the universe, right? So he ended up emanating in the same way as the same demon. But how do you deal? Because also in Mahamudra it says you shouldn't expel or try to avoid the anger, but instead of that, transforming it. And then whenever anger comes to you, which it comes a lot with me, at least here in Mexico City, because of a bunch of spirits and nagas and things that I've been talking with Venerable Ravina, and also to a certain degree. And so it
Oh, you're in
tires
Mexico
me.
City?
Yes, I am.
Ah, nice. I love Mexico City. The best food in the world. Some of the best food in the world. Sorry. Go ahead, yeah.
And so, well, I don't know. I guess at what point, it's only after you realize emptiness and or maybe even at the 8 bhumi, when you're already like, you have removed all the negative afflictions and just like removing what it was left there. But then, is it only into that point or only until you're a Buddha that you can work with that choleric bodhicitta? Is it only after you realize emptiness that you can work with this so that you do not create negative karma? Or
what are you calling it? Which bodhicitta? That I'm just
choleric bodhicitta. Like when you're running like Mahakala, Haryagriva, Vajrakilaya, any of the choleric emanations.
but I'm still missing the word. You mean like wrathful?
Oh yes, sorry. The thing is that we said colérico, but yeah.
Wrathful. Oh, colérico. I never heard that word before. Sorry. Okay, but it's the same. Colérico lo mismo de wrathful. See? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's your question. Well, the truth is, like the bodhicitta is neither wrathful nor non-wrathful. Like, right. So in a sense, it's sort of like you're talking about the activity aspect of enlightened mind. So yeah, like wrath itself, it would be something that would come out of it's one of the 4 activities, So we have like peace, enrichment, pacifying, enriching. Come on, I'm forgetting the third one. You know the third one? Attracting. Yeah, that's it. Like being attraction, and then wrathful. And so actually attraction usually comes before enriching. So these are the 4 activities that come from enlightened mind. So really you're talking about enlightened mind. So it's not the practice of bodhicitta, it's like the fruition of bodhicitta, right? And so these 4 activities, they just happen in relationship to sentient beings, because these 4 activities are how sentient beings relate, right? Like we could see it in the human world. I don't know, maybe we can think of some other options, but pretty much I think all the activity we can see related to one of these 4, some version of peaceful means or pacifying, some means of like attraction, some means of enriching, or some means of like anger or violence or something like that. So the activity of the Buddhas is just, it's not a thought, it's not an intention, it just happens in relation to beings, right? So, I mean, that's it. There's no other reason. But maybe there's something more to your question, like how do we relate to that or something like that?
Well, I mean, everything that I experience in the world is because it's in me, or it's my mind, it's my samsaric experience, right?
Yeah.
It will be the same with nirvana. That's why they say that it's the same taste. There's no difference between samsara or nirvana, only when you realize it's the same but different. I don't know how it would be whenever.
Well, it's a little different because enlightenment is, you also realize what's called the 2 types of omniscience. So it's different than you and I right now. Like right now we have the potential for the 2 types of omniscience. You know this word omniscience? Yes. Yeah, we have the potential, but we're not experiencing that. The potential is in our Buddha nature. But for an enlightened being, they've realized that. And the 2 types are like the full realization of Dharmakaya, which is the the full realization of emptiness, right? And then the second is they know the nature of all phenomena. So this is where it gets like a little bit down the rabbit hole, but it's kind of related to what we were talking about earlier. So that means that a Buddha doesn't see suffering, right? They don't have suffering anymore, so there's not a basis to see it. But they have this second type of omniscience that knows the nature of all phenomena, meaning not only do they know like all the thoughts that you and I have, all of the experiences, but they know the karma that created those. They know all of the steps of interdependence that happen there. So in that way, they see, you see what I'm saying? But they see without any kind of reification. So it's like kind of this simultaneous seeing where things are, there's no dualistic seeing, there's no dualistic clinging, but they can see our duality. So it goes back to the analogy I used before. Like this is what's very unique. Like we were using this analogy of nightmare, right? Like someone having a nightmare. A Buddha can actually come into our nightmare and then wake us up from the nightmare, but they're not in the nightmare when they're in their nightmare. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. We have the perception they're in the nightmare, but they can do that. So that's, I mean, this is a kind of beyond how it doesn't work in normal world. It's beyond any kind of way we normally do things in our conceptual way. So I don't know if that kind of hints at your question, but that's what I thought of when you were asking it.
Yeah, it does. But that leads me to another thing. You mentioned the Dharmakaya, and then all Buddhas do experience the same Dharmakaya, right? Or is it that they are all one in Dharmakaya, or not really?
Yeah, that's like one of the biggest questions that gets asked. I still have this question because I've heard different versions. Like Lama Zopa Rinpoche said once, it's like a drop of the ocean going into the ocean, But at the same time, does that mean they become all one mind, like that, or I still have questions about this. It's a very deep question. I can't say definitively, what that is, but it seems like, yes, they like the language. No, you have to remember a lot of this language, like I was saying, it's not literal or, things like that. So they usually say like, when a Buddha manifests, it's manifesting out of the Dharmakaya, which it's not like their singular Dharmakaya. It's Dharmakaya collective, but I don't think it's collective, I think it's something kind of we can't understand like that, because it's sort of like, because the way dualistic mind thinks, conceptual mind thinks, is it either has to be this or that. You see what I'm saying? It either has to be this collective thing, which is also objectifying it. It's not, that's also not emptiness, or it has to be singular. And I think it's kind of beyond both of those. This is the way I'm thinking of it now. I really don't know, but I'm kind of just using emptiness reasoning, because if there was a collective Dharmakaya, we could say, that's it. And then it wouldn't be empty of true existence. It would be something true. If we could say there's a singular Dharmakaya, like again, it would be truly existent. So I think you got to remember this goes outside of that completely. Yeah, but it's a good question. I think keep studying that, because there's different answers to that. I haven't seen like a singular answer. That's what I'm trying to say. There's different takes on that. But how did it relate to what you were thinking for a second ago?
Yeah, sorry.
What did you think of that? What was that in relation to?
Well, I asked the same to Don Henrik recently, and he said the same, that he doesn't know, because we would not be able to experience it or to explain it until we experience. And then I guess that it relates to what they say, or Lama Tsongkhapa used to say that it's an experiential thing. We cannot put it in words, because if we put it in words, it's not what we have experienced already. So, but I don't know, to listen like different views, I guess that it helps me little by little. And
he said the only thing I heard Lama Zopa say is like more of an analogy, where he said it's like, I don't remember the full analogy, but it's basically like, if you take, this means when we're enlightened, like when we're actually becoming enlightened. He was saying it's like taking a drop of water into the ocean. You know, that's what he was saying. He didn't really elaborate on that. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, good questions. Keep going. All right. So maybe we'll stop here. Thanks, Jack, for putting the quote there. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you very much. Yeah, work with verse 7 and 8. Like I said, try to use them as a reflective meditation, right? Meditating on the own nature of your samsara, as well as use it as a way to generate bodhicitta with others. Yeah. Muchas gracias. Have a good time. Buenas noches. Okay. Sorry, go ahead,
Scott,
Gina.
I have a dedication prayers.
Oh,
if
yeah,
you
yeah,
want to
yeah.
go through
Let's
them in
dedicate.
long
Sorry.
life prayers. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. Sorry, I almost forgot. I got so caught up. We'll just do it in English for the sake of time. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly gain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel Bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, the incomparably kind Supreme Tenzin Gyatso, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands. Please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now, holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings. Through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make a request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings who suddenly depart to peace, what a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good
Gina,
night,
for hosting.
everyone. Welcome. We'll see you all next week. Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.